So, before we get started, can I just get a quick show of hands of who here is a developer or engineer? Most of you. Any designers? A couple. Product owners, project managers? Yeah. Anyone else I missed? Okay, cool. So, you guys are all in the right place. I wanted to give this talk to, we probably all heard someone say something like, when looking at a design, it just needs to pop more, can we jazz it up, or especially, I just don't like it, but I can't explain why. And I wanted to give this talk to kind of give some quick, easy, simple principles to follow to be able to provide better feedback to designers. And what made me think about doing this is I went to art and design school quite a while ago, and I always told people that the thing that I learned the most being there was how to do critiques, how to talk about my designs, how to receive feedback from people, and how to, you might have worked on something really hard and received some difficult feedback and being able to take that in and respond to it. And since then, I've done a lot of other things. I went into web design and front-end development out of school, and I owned my own company for about 4 years, so managed a lot of projects, designed apps when iOS and Android were first coming out, and now I've been a UX designer for about 4 years here at Deloitte Digital in Denver. So I've been taking some time to kind of revisit myself, the way that I give feedback to designers and the way I'm receiving that feedback, and that just made me think, there's actually some pretty simple things here that a lot of people just don't necessarily know how to articulate. So that's what we're going to talk about. Pretty simple agenda. First, we're going to just talk about why this is important, why you should care about giving good feedback. We'll focus mostly in on how to do that. We'll have a little bit of a design 101. Talk about the when and where, because there's definitely some good times and bad times to give feedback. And hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. And then throughout, we'll have some examples of ways to turn poor feedback into good feedback. I also just want to mention that I will have a link to the slides at the end, so don't feel like you have to write everything down. Okay, so why? First things first, why should you care about giving good design feedback? Your ultimate goal should be to create better products. As a side effect, by providing good feedback, you'll be able to foster mutual respect and understanding within your team. So by following simple principles, if a designer knows that they'll receive thoughtful, timely feedback from you, they'll respect that and understand that and appreciate it, and the better off you all be. So, some good reasons to provide feedback on design should be centered around either user experience, visual design, or development. So, if there's concerns with the user experience of an application or a product, that's definitely a good thing to talk about. Visual design, this is the one that's kind of the trickiest that we'll talk about quite a bit, but if there's things that have to do with the visual design patterns or hierarchy, that's the kind of underlying issues that you'll want to address. And then from the development side, if there's things that are particularly complex that you could simplify with a similar solution, that's always a good thing to talk about. Bad reasons would include, I don't like it. It's okay to not like it, but you have to be able to expand on that and explain why. And that it's just too hard to develop. There's definitely conversations that can be had there about whether the development effort outweighs the user need, but it can't just be an outright, we're not doing this for that reason. So the ultimate challenge in all this is explaining why you're giving the feedback. You want to be able to get to the root of the issue, both for yourself to explain it and for the designer to understand it. So when you're giving feedback, you want to make sure that you're providing justifications, because those are going to be greater than opinion. If you're providing solid justifications, then your team can discuss the merits of the justifications instead of making it a battle of personal opinions. So if you consider the difference between a research paper and an opinion essay, they can both be really persuasive, but a research paper based in fact and reasoning and well-reasoned conclusions is going to hold more weight than something that's purely opinions or personal beliefs. So how do we do this? First, some ground rules. do want to make sure to ask questions to understand the thought process. There could be a really good business reason or a use case for the decision that you're unaware of, so it's good to have a conversation and try to understand that. Of course, you do want to explain the why behind each piece of feedback, being specific, intentional, not vague. And you want to stay focused on your users. You want to think about how your users will perceive the design, not just what you think about it. You want to stay focused on the feature or problem at hand, so taking it one step at a time. Don't pile on too much at once. Go through one issue at a time. If you're in a formal review setting, you should have some context about what you should or shouldn't be giving feedback on, so you'll want to make sure to stick with that. And then make sure to point out positives as well as negatives. This can depend on the context and the designer. If you're just giving a few quick notes from reviewing design, it's probably not a big deal. But if you're in a more formal setting with a lot of people giving a designer a lot of feedback, it's always good to point out things that are working with the design, so if they go back and make changes, they don't remove some of those elements that are doing just fine and aren't being mentioned. You don't want to make it personal, so it's good to avoid saying you. It's okay if you're asking a question, why did you do this? Why did you do that? But if you're pointing out something with a specific design, it's better to talk about the design itself instead of what the designer did. So an example of that, instead of saying, I don't like how big you made this button, you could ask, why does this button have so much prominence on the page? So this is one thing that's kind of helping get to the root of the issue by prompting a conversation and asking questions instead of being critical on a specific thing that the designer did or didn't do. Another example of giving positive user-centered feedback would be saying something like, the get a quote button on the page is the first thing that catches my eye. That's great, because that's what we want our users to do. There's also a lot of good ground rules for designers when they're receiving feedback, so touch on that a little bit. You do want to frame the context of what you want to receive feedback on. You do want to ask clarifying questions if you're not getting the why from people. So again, trying to get to the underlying reason. Is it an issue with size, color hierarchy? We'll get into these more in a little bit. And also thinking about when someone says something, is that a personal reaction, or would our target audience and our users think the same way? You do want to listen and do not interrupt. So let someone complete their thought before defending your work, and then, of course, do defend your work. Explain the thought process behind the current design decisions, other options that were considered, pros and cons that were weighed. Maybe it's something like, I thought about doing it that way actually, but there's XYZ problems with it and it doesn't work as well as this design. You do want to acknowledge when an idea is worth exploring further, so it's okay to say, that's a great point, or I didn't think of that, I'm going to take that into consideration. And of course, you do want to close the conversation with next steps. So whether it's, I'm going to write that down and think about incorporating it for our next client review, or I think we could test that as an alternative to the current design, or it might be something where this decision is pretty well solidified and validated and tested, and it's okay to say, I appreciate your input, but based on discussion with the client or testing we've already done, I believe that this design is still the best approach. As a designer, you should not be closed-minded or stuck within your design without good reason and data backing it up. You shouldn't dismiss someone's comments just because they aren't a designer. And you don't want to get frustrated or defensive. So it's your job, when you're giving feedback to a designer, to be helping your design team. If you're helping them and you're not just tearing them down and being overly critical, they're going to take you seriously, and again, you'll help your team and create better products in the end. Another way to do that is by asking probing questions that can encourage critical thinking within the design team and within the team as a whole. So how might we questions are one way to do that. So instead of just saying you should change this or do that instead, you can set up the change you want to see within the context of a question. So for example, instead of saying something like, you should make the primary CTA bigger, you could ask, how might we make the primary CTA more prominent? So prompting critical thought and conversation can help get to that root of the problem and help the team solve it. So visual design, this is kind of the root of where a lot of the I don't like it doesn't feel right stems from. So there's usually some pretty simple visual design principles that are driving those feelings that people just might not know how to articulate. So obviously a lot of designers go to art school for several years to learn about these principles, but at the core they're all really simple. So we're going to take a few minutes and do a little Design 101 primer, and the first thing we're going to talk about is hierarchy. So visual hierarchy is the order in which a user processes information on a page. So some of the principles that designers use to create visual hierarchy include size. So objects that are bigger demand more attention. Using size as a hierarchy tool is a good way of guiding a user's eye to a particular portion of the page by having the most important things on the page larger than the things that are less important. Heading sizes is a really obvious example of that, where usually the H1 is bigger than H2, bigger than H3, etc. Color and contrast. So using a single color, as InVision does in this example, is one way of drawing attention to elements on the page. So they have that bright magenta for their Get Started, Sign Up for Free, Explore InVision, and their logo. So they're using it very intentionally and sparingly. Color can also be used a lot more widely to have multiple colors for categorization. It has emotional aspects, and there's a whole other talk at this conference about color theory, so check that out if you want to learn more. Space and density. So densely packing elements into a space will make it feel heavy and cluttered. But on the flip side, if elements are too spaced out, they might lose relationships to one another. So in these examples, Amazon obviously is a very successful and popular site, but I would argue that there's a little bit too much density here. There's not a lot of space between the sections, and there's not a lot of variety in size either. That red is really the only thing that is creating a strong hierarchy on the page. And on the flip side, Evernote has some nice open space going on, but as you're scrolling through, there's actually you can lose the association between some of those icons and the content that they're related to. Especially down here at the bottom, the brain is actually supposed to be with the text box on the left, but it kind of looks like it's more with the text below, which is an issue of proximity, which we'll talk about in a second. So instead of saying something like, this page is too busy, you could say, this page is lacking a clear hierarchy, or at first look, I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to focus on. Something else here that's good to talk about as a team is to know what the top priorities for a page or a section of an app is. So if you don't know, it's good to ask, what are our top 3 priorities here? Or what's the main thing we want users to be doing? And then have a conversation about how can we emphasize that or those few things more and de-emphasize elements here that are less important. So Gestalt Principles. Gestalt is a German word meaning shape or form, and it's a group of visual perception principles that's built on the theory that an organized whole is perceived as greater than the sum of its parts. So we're not going to talk about all of these, but we're going to talk about a few that are most related to digital design. Closure is one that's interesting. If you look at the A, your eye will automatically fill in that line of the A because it's a shape that it recognizes, even if the whole shape isn't there. So our brains are always looking for pattern and logic and structure to make sense of all the inputs that we receive. And Gestalt principles are just ways of explaining some of those things that our brains do automatically. So proximity is a big one. That was kind of the example with Evernote. And then, this is probably difficult to see with the line breaks on the screen, but the screenshot on the left is from a Medium article, just the default layout that they use for bulleted lists. And there's pretty even space at the top of the list, in between the list items, and at the bottom of the list. But the bullets really have to do with the text above. The text above is what's introducing them. So on the right, there's some subtle adjustments to the space between elements. The bullets are closer together, they're closer to the text above, and farther away from the text below, so that they now are they're closer in proximity to that introductory text, and will feel more related to that than equally separate from all the elements above and below. So instead of saying something like, I think the add to cart button is too far away from the product title, if you say that the add to cart button and the product title, if the add to cart button and product title were closer together, they would appear more related to our users. Common region. Elements placed within the same region will be perceived as grouped. So I think Facebook does a really good job of this. They have a lot going on, but they use regions in a really smart way. So obviously you have your header bar with the background color. You have a list of links on the left side, which are in the same region as they don't have any box around them. Then you have the elements of your newsfeed with everything being grouped into white boxes and being very close together. And then you have your chat elements in another area on the far right side of the page. So continuity. Elements following a continuous line are perceived as grouped. iOS horizontal scrolling uses this pattern really well. All of the elements follow the same line and carry off the screen, so your brain understands that that's where the content lives, and it's more intuitive to just swipe and find it there. Continuity helps us interpret direction and movement through a composition. So in most web design, that's going to be more of a vertical continuity of elements, and then when you disrupt that continuity, it can help signal the end of a section. Obviously, with a lot of full screen web design, you'll see sections that have more of the color block all the way across the screen. That's an example of really breaking that continuity in a really strong way to delineate different sections. And similarity. Elements sharing similar visual characteristics are perceived to be more related than those not sharing similar characteristics. So in this example, with social media icons, the first set on the left, they're similar only in size. In the middle, they're similar in size, shape, and style. And on the right, they're similar in size, shape, color, and style. So on the flip side, the more similar items are, the more difficult it's going to be to distinguish the differences quickly. So that's kind of the trade-off. Obviously, on the left, people are going to see the social media type that they're looking for more quickly than the icons on the right, which look very similar. So that's kind of a trade-off when you're thinking about the user experience on that. But instead of saying something like it looks bad with all the social media icons of different colors, you could say this section would be more balanced if the social media icons were more similar in color and shape. So if you don't like a design we're looking at, hopefully these things can help you have some concrete elements to think about to try to figure out why and what it is you don't like. Is there an issue with the hierarchy? Is it hard to understand where you're supposed to be focusing? Is the page lacking that continuity and flow? Is there too much or too little similarity or color or contrast? Are there issues with the proximity between related elements? Is there too much density on the page? Those are the types of underlying visual design principles that designers think about when they're designing a page, and if you can consider those elements and provide that feedback within that context, it's going to be really helpful to designers. So user experience feedback. Some do's and don'ts here. Do ask if there's research or data backing up a design decision. Do point out elements that may be unclear or confusing to you. If you are a potential user and you didn't understand something at first look or at the first time you were using a new design or new feature in the product you're working on, that's a really, really valid piece of feedback for a designer who might have been working on that for a long time and is really ingrained in that. So to hear that from someone with kind of fresh perspective that, hey, I didn't quite get this right away, that's really definitely valid. So, but of course, do think about what target users would think, not just what you think. So definitely bring it up, but recognize that what works for you or doesn't work for you isn't necessarily what your target users will work for them or not. Do suggest testing if that's something that your UX team does frequently. If there's some internal disagreement and some people really want one way, other people really want another way, that's a really good example to just take that away and test that and see what users really think. And again, don't assume that things you find easy will be easy for your users. So one kind of specific example here is that as most of us tech-savvy users, you're probably used to things auto-saving when you're filling out a form. But there's been research that with older demographics, they really like having an explicit save button, so there's something to confirm. It's really clear to them. So instead of just assuming, hey, our page is going to be auto-saving, so we should remove that save button, it's good to ask and have a conversation. Do we have any data about our users to know whether the save button is going to be necessary for them? And then development feedback. So as a developer, you should absolutely feel comfortable providing feedback to a designer. But again, there's some good do's and don'ts to follow. Do point out design details that don't follow an expected or established pattern. So if you were anticipating to develop something one way based on an existing pattern in your project, a standard framework, something like that, and the design calls for something different, that's a good opportunity to have a conversation about why. There may be, again, a really good user reason for doing that, and there's also the chance that it just was an oversight or something didn't quite get designed on the page exactly as intended. Do explain why something is difficult to develop. So the better a designer understands the underlying effort and process of development, the easier it's going to be for them to follow those patterns and not break from the norm going forward. Do suggest similar alternatives that would reduce dev scope. So I think it's always really helpful as a designer when a developer comes to me with an idea like, hey, instead of doing it this way, what if we just tweaked it a little bit like this and it'll make it loads easier for me. A lot of times it's not that much of a user experience difference, so it can often be a quick conversation to make a tiny tweak that'll make things a lot easier for everybody. But again, do expect to weigh the dev complexity with user and business goals. So if there's a big change that you want to propose, the whole team should be able to have a discussion about what are the trade-offs between the dev effort and the user experience, and you shouldn't just care about prioritizing workload over your users. If there's going to be an issue with sprint scope or deliverable deadlines, that should be part of the conversation. It shouldn't just be, we can't do that, that's going to take too long. It's good to just have a conversation about those things. So one more example, instead of saying, we can't implement this date picker style, you could say, based on the date picker we used on the make a reservation page, I assumed we'd use the same control in the calendar settings. Is there a reason that a different control was designed? And when and where. Number one rule of when and where to give design feedback is do not give feedback during client meetings, or if it's an internal team with a high-stakes executive presentation, things like that. There's not much worse as a designer than having to address internal feedback at the same time during a meeting that's intended for the client. So instead, if you're in a situation like that and you see things that you want to comment on, take notes and make sure to share them with your design team afterwards. So instead of starting to give design feedback, and again, sorry, this is additional. Instead of starting to give feedback as soon as the client meeting ends, it's good to just ask first, I have a few comments, can I share them with you now? Would you prefer to set up a meeting? And that kind of leads into some of the do's and don'ts. It's always good to ask if the time and place is right to give feedback about a particular topic. You want to make sure the designers both in the right place in their design process and just kind of state of mind to take in that type of the feedback that you might have. And also, you have to consider the timing of your feedback with the maturity of the design. If it's the first draft of a wireframe and you have a comment about text on a button, that might be too early. If it's already been seen and approved by the client, that's probably too late. And obviously you want to avoid getting to that point and not having the opportunity. So we'll talk about that also. And Pixar has a really nice rule of thumb in this space. I'll call it the 25-75% rule. They try to present work for feedback when it's between 25% complete and 75% complete. So it's not too early to be a design by committee situation, and it's not too late where it's going to be difficult and time consuming to create changes. And you will want to work into existing processes as when possible. So we'll talk about that in a second. And don't just email a laundry list of changes you want to see, and don't stand over your designer's shoulder when they're working and start to make comments. So processes for giving feedback. This is a really good thing that you should hopefully be able to decide as a team what the right when and where is for giving feedback on designs. And hopefully you're always given dedicated time to give feedback, whether it's a design and dev sync, whether there's formal design critiques that you can participate in. You do want to make sure that you have that avenue and that opportunity, so again, you don't get into a situation where you're told, this is final, go develop it, and there's a lot of issues that you didn't get to talk about. So choosing the right channel. It is okay to send emails if there's things that are kind of short and sweet. If it's easy to understand what your point is, or if it's minor details like label changes or button inconsistencies, that's maybe not a big deal. If you use Jira for tracking design details, that can be an option as well. If you're co-located with your design team, it may be a natural part of your process to bring things up as they arise and kind of have impromptu conversations, maybe continuing discussions after daily stand-ups. And then sometimes there's things that maybe don't seem that big, but then as soon as a conversation starts, everybody realizes that there's a lot more underlying issues that need to be discussed, so you might want to plan a one-off meeting if that starts to happen. And then participating in more formal design reviews or critiques is going to be a more ideal situation. So talking about that a little bit more, who else is involved in design critiques can vary based on team size, especially. It can get harder to manage that when a team is really big. So there's a possibility that you're on a team that designers go and do this, but you're not necessarily a part of. So as a developer, you could ask to sit in on that, or you could ask to set up specific developer feedback sessions if there's not currently a time to do that. But critiques can be a really good place for the entire team to learn and improve, and to, again, create better products. And if team members approach critiques by thinking, what can each of us learn from the work the designer has done, and help the designer instead of approaching it as, what can we tell this designer about their work, it won't be as stressful, and it can be helpful for the whole team. So to set up critiques for success, you'll want to make sure that clear roles are identified. So you have a presenter, who would be the designer, a facilitator. Ideally, facilitator should not be the designer. If you can have someone who's kind of a neutral party, like a scrum master or a project manager, that can be really useful. And it's also good to have a note taker. The designer might want to just do that themselves, or they might ask the facilitator to do that. The presenter should send materials to participants ahead of time, if possible, and provide some purpose and reason for the critique, and again, what to give feedback on and what not to give feedback on in that session. I think this is something that doesn't happen a lot on teams, but if you're able to do it and give people time to think about it and formulate thoughts ahead of time, that can be really helpful. The presenter should, when you start the critique, explain the problem that's being solved, what the user goals are, maybe some other options that they explored, and how they ended up on the design where it is. And then again, they should ask specific questions that they want feedback on, Maybe there's a particular issue with the design that they've been going back and forth on that they want to get some thoughts on which way to go. It's always good, instead of asking generic questions like, what do you think? And then when you start a critique, the facilitator should reiterate some of the ground rules. So again, some of the things we talked about earlier on, making sure to provide justification and not just opinion, asking clarifying questions, not making it personal, not interrupting, staying focused on one element at a time, and of course, thinking about our users. So in closing, if you voiced your opinion and provided solid justification, and the product team or the design team ultimately decides to go in a different direction, it's best to just respect that as a teammate. It's okay to ask why and try to get some context, but it's good to not dwell on it and to move on and just know that you're doing the best you can to provide solid input that gets to the root of the problem. So by focusing on visual design principles and keeping your users in mind, you'll be better equipped to clearly explain the why and get to that root of the issue and have constructive conversations with your design team. And hopefully you'll create better products because of it. And I think that's it. So. The link to the slides is right there on SlideShare. So it's just 2J. There's nothing missing there. Any questions? Yeah.
So I actually was kind of wondering, as like a backend developer or working with a backend team that might use the product from here and there, they have an opinion. How do you get like good opinions from them, even if they don't have like the facts to back it up or anything? It is still very.
Yeah. So he's asking. I'll see if I can paraphrase it. As a backend developer, how to try to get more than just opinion. Yeah, so I think if a designer is having a conversation, they know these principles and the developers may not, so it's good for them to try to bring them up, to point them out. So if if a developer thinks, oh, it's just not, I mean, some of these things, like if they're saying they don't like it, you can try to figure out ways of clarifying. Is it the design style? Is it the color? Is it the size of things? Is it relationships between different elements? Is it a user experience concern that there's 5 different things to do on the page and they think there should just be one thing to do on the page? Those are the types of things that designers should hopefully be able to look at the context of the page and try to ask those types of probing questions to see if they can get more of that out of developers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, yep. Anything else? Yeah.
So I regularly work with a graphic designer that actually is doing web design, and I feel like one of the biggest things that we're going to have to figure out how to talk about is me giving feedback that a tool needs to be, it can't be too repetitive in design, it needs to be able to accept a random amount of text or a random amount of width, and I can't figure out how to relay that to the designer in a way where he can say, all right, here, I get that, but here I'm going to leave it down. I should be able to be flexible, and I need to be able to accept those bounds.
Yeah. No, I do get what you're saying, especially since responsive design has become so popular. It used to be that you could design a page and know that your line, if you knew what your headline was going to be, you knew it was always going to look that way. It was never going to wrap. So I think that one thing you could do is sit down and look at some responsive websites together to just show examples of, hey, here's some of the ways that our design may have to change in these different situations. If you're doing like a CMS project and you have a client that's going to be changing things themselves, you could try to set some parameters from a CMS perspective that you would want to share with the client to say, headlines should be between 50 and 100 characters, and then ask the designer to plan for, hey, can you think about how this is going to look at the shortest end, 50 characters, and at the largest end, 100 characters? So maybe there's ways to provide just some types of guidelines or endpoints that they can think about.
Do you ask them to mock up both the small and that's a side question.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how much time you have, and if you're in a more agile environment where you can get things into code quicker and look at it that way, that could be helpful. If the designer has time and you can kind of give a few bullet points of, here's a few different scenarios to think about, can we mock up some of these? And then once they do it once or twice, maybe they won't have to do it every time going forward. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it would be more of if they gave the designers picture this as 1,000 characters versus what you have that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Anything else? All right, cool. So just want to give one quick plug. We are hiring at Deloitte Digital for mid-level and senior UX designers, visual designers, and I believe also front-end developers. So if anyone is interested, come chat with me, and I'll be here for a little bit.